I am working at the Instituto de Robótica e Informática Industrial, where I developed my research thesis on ethics, artificial intelligence, and social robotics within the framework of a project which is called Human-Centered Robotics. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this workshop for giving me the chance of being here today with you all, and also for trying to contribute to the interesting discussions that are having place here today by briefly presenting my paper, which I have called Social Robotics and the Outsource of Agency, Untangling the Ethical Approach. So let me begin with a little remark on the idea behind this paper. The paper wants to contribute to the ethical reflection on social robotics, but how? By means of clarifying the perspective from which we should approach this techno-scientific field of intelligent robotics. So it's basically a reflection on how to reflect upon social robotics when we want to depart from an ethical point of view. And it's important to keep this in mind, especially if you want to read the paper, because you will see it does not focus on a particular ethical problem posed by social robotics, but rather it focuses on what I would call a previous stage, which is the one of disclosing the perspective from which to direct our ethical gaze. So which is the reason for my proposal? The reason is that because of the upgrading technological autonomy of intelligent robots, the current landscape of ethical reflection on social robotics is based on a phenomenon that I have identified as the outsource of agency. What do I mean by that? I mean that most concerns mainly arise in view of an understanding of robots as entities in which we can outsource, that is, we can delegate or we can assign both cognitive and resolutive agency in certain tasks within the framework of our everyday activities. And what happens with that, because of this phenomenon, is that it gives place to easily place to a misguided ethical approach to social robotics, because it fosters to turn the focus mainly on the doing of these entities. By understanding intelligent robots as artificial agents that can take over actions with specific goals within a given context, what we do is we rush and put the emphasis on granting that they act correctly, that they behave correctly, so that they can legitimately enter our social spaces. So we turn focus mainly on robots' behavior or the possibility of endorsing them with more competence, which is of course very interesting. That's what machine ethics does. But that can overlook the primary focus. Why do I say that? Because as I argue in the paper, for me, the main question of an ethical approach to social robotics is not the question about the doing, but rather the question about the being. Prior to correctly do, a social robot must correctly be, which is something that has to do with the idea of being legitimate, with the idea of having sense. Asking about the being implies to think about the coherence existing between the artificial, so the reasons of being of this artificial agent and the purposes it is aimed to serve through its functionalities. So it's basically to think in terms of an adequacy between our goals, our values, and the actions we take so that to arrive to achieve these goals. Right? So I think it's urgent to draw attention to this, because this should be the question primarily shaping our perspective when thinking upon social robotics, when thinking in terms of all these stages of development and deployment. I like to put it like that. The big question is like the lenses through which we should actually look at social robotics. And why is that? The reasons for my stance are basically twofold. On the one hand, the big question allows to ethically approach social robotics in a way that is consistent with the technological nature of the field. Remind that the goal of social robotics, as it always happens with every technological field of activity, is external to itself. It is linked to the field in which its artifacts are expected to serve as a means of support. That means that a suitable ethical approach, as Andreas has already said that, I think, in the morning, and I found that very interesting, because an ethical approach to social robotics should always require of a thinking in a situated way, in a contextualized way. Ethical challenges must be always identified and addressed from an awareness of the goals at which interaction is aimed. And on the other hand, the being question also unfolds the potential of an ethical gaze on social robotics, because it brings to light a central concept, which is the one of interest. it reminds us that social robots, because of being human-made artifacts, always respond to a certain purpose. And this is a purpose that's decided by humans from within a particular social, political, and cultural context. So they indeed have agency, but it's somehow an interested one. It's an interested agency. This allows us to distance ourselves from this vision of robots as entities which are individual and with a somehow well delimited and closed and even independent agency, and engage in a more mature ethical reflection on the transformative force of social robotics. In which sense? First of all, the being question and adopting this perspective avoids to reduce the ethical approach to what could be said to be a critical assessment of the foreseeable impacts of robots, which seems to be the case in most of the ethical current literature on social robotics. There are well-known difficulties to the consequentialist ethical approaches, but there is one of them which I want to highlight because I think we are not talking enough about that, and is the one that by reflecting upon social robotics always in view of impacts, we are in a risk of failing or turning the ethical gaze into a moral assessment. That means turning ethics into moral conservatism. Instead, if we take the being question, because then we focus and we concentrate on how humans are the ones deciding the purposes of these artifacts, then we can adopt the ethical attitude of revisiting our principles, revisiting our values, our goals, and then deciding the course of our actions within this framework. Secondly, and the last thing, is that the being question also allows us to enlarge the spheres of human life that must be considered in an ethical approach to social robotics. It is noticeable that the current ethical literature mostly focuses on assessing the impacts of such artifacts, but the impacts that those artifacts have with the individuals that they interact with. So it's a focus on the individual level of human life. If we depart from the being question instead, we can then engage in a more exhaustive ethical approach that takes also into account other spheres, because then we reflect about how we change landscape of activities and practices, and think also about other spheres or other levels of human life, such as the interpersonal, the sectorial, the social, the institutional one, and so on. So to sum up, the being question allows for a proper ethical approach to social robotics, which is one that really enables us to guide the technological restructuring power of human practices. And that would be it. I will be very happy if you have some comments or questions that we can discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's not so much time for questions, but I think we have one from Iran.
Yes, I try to do it fast. Thank you, Julia. It was very refreshing and to hear different kind of perspective from philosophical point of view. I think there is a reason for, we focus on doing rather than being, and the reason for that is actually it's much simpler to enrich the robot behaviors with basically ethical rules. But if you want to really focus on being, then the question arises how the governance can take place. Who's to decide that what I'm going to research on, is it me, myself, or is it someone else tell me, oh no, this is not the good question to pursue scientifically. So what's your take on this?
I think, Aidan, that's very, very interesting, because actually that's the point, right? That's the point when we think about the being question, we become aware that, of course, the goals, so the goals of our activity are dependent or of interests. Somebody has said that already. And interests in a techno-scientific field of activity as intelligent robotics are very diverse. We have the interests of the person that are like trying to develop the robot. Then we have the interests of these professionals that are in the context in which the robot are supposed to help. And then we have politicians deciding which measures do they encourage or not, like in sense of economical policies, but also in what they adopt afterwards in an institutional way. So of course there are so many interests that the first steps would be to say, first step is we have these interests, we put them on table, and then we decide, because if not, it happens what you are pointing at. I am told that I should be researching on this field or on that field, and I have been told that more directly or indirectly, but at the end, is it how it works? So we should really enlarge also discussions beyond the institutions and reach the society and try to be all engaged in that.
Thank you very much.